Tsunami. On November 5th, a measured 10.6 earthquake struck the mid-Atlantic tectonic ridge, triggering a devastating tsunami off the coast of southern Florida. As large as the earthquake was, few people felt it on land, and the only real warning sign of disaster came with the dramatically receding waterline on the Florida beaches, exposing much of the ocean floor. The people in and around the direct area knew enough to run, but the wall of water was not escapable. The Florida Keys was ravaged, as well as Chicken Shoals and much of the Bahamas. It was the worst catastrophic tsunami since the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004, where some 200,000 people lost their lives. It is still unclear how many died in Florida that day, or in the perilous days to follow. 1. He wanted to breathe and choked on water. He found his legs and kicked, the world rising with his stomach to meet him on the broken surface, coughing the salt water out of his lungs. Then came his arms, and he slapped them in the water in manic pinwheels of white foam. He didn't care where he was or why. All that was important to him was breathing, and he tried his best. Once his heart rate had begun to slow, and he relearned how to float, he looked around. There was nothing on either side of him. He was in an endless ocean. There were no buildings or trees. Aside from that, he was utterly disoriented. He didn't know how he'd gotten into that particular situation, floating like a piece of beached wood in the middle of nowhere. He had absolutely no prior memory. As far as he was concerned, nothing could explain why he had woken up underwater. No, nothing could explain this. All he knew was that he had to start swimming. With no idea for where to point his arrow, he followed the natural stream of his river, carrying him downstream. The temperature on the breeze and the color of the water seemed to tell him the time. A floating board came out of nowhere and nudged against him, trying to grab his attention. He hung off it thankfully, setting his arms and legs limp for a much-needed rest. He looked over at the sun, and it was still at its highest point in the sky. Reflecting harshly off the surface of the water like a mirror, a memory flashed through his mind. He was a boy swimming in his childhood pool. For a moment he felt like he was really there. The ocean became a box, and he was much heavier, dragging his feet against the bottom of the pool. He liked how the linoleum tiles clicked against his toenails. Then the bottom dropped out, and the deep end consumed him. He lost the surface and tried to find the bottom, his legs extended as far as they could stretch, his toes begging for purchase. He snapped out of his daydream, dipping his face once underwater to wake himself up. At that moment he remembered the tsunami, surging through the alleyways and down the busy streets, carrying cars and people with it. He remembered ducking behind a building with his son Stuart as the waters took them both. As naive as he had been in the moment, he thought he could plant his feet and hold on to his son's shoulders, but he'd been so wrong. The water hit him like a train and tore his son away from him, without a fight, without a moment's hesitation. Dylan could see plenty of signs of civilization around him, in the refuge and debris clogging the many canals and makeshift river streams, pieces of palm trees, wood, and plaster. He couldn't see a single person in the area, or hear their screams for help. He thought he might try calling out, so he screamed his wife's name, his son's, and then his daughter's. Mostly he called for Stuart, because he shouldn't be too far. Dylan could only hope. His wife Deborah and daughter Emma were together on the beach, while Dylan took Stuart into town. He could only hope that Deborah had seen the wave in enough time to do something, to find higher ground. He hoped that she had found better luck than him, blindsided by a wall of water. All he could think to do was duck behind the building, yanking his son after him. Why hadn't he thought of something else? What else could he have done? He cried for his family as he struggled to keep his head above water, screaming his children's names, but receiving a mouthful of salty water for his efforts. "Hey!" he heard someone yell. He looked around and saw a woman waving her arms at him frantically in the air. She stood inside a boat, a battered dinghy by the looks of it, and it was physically wedged in a thicket of collected trash and wreckage, like a holiday wreath, anchored motionless in the parting current. Dylan could do little about the current, whisking him quickly away. The woman and her boat were perhaps 100 yards away, and to swim in her direction was easier imagined than done, especially with the many obstacles he had to hazard, like entire sheets of metal, street signs, and battering-ram sections of palm trees, charging by like floats on parade. He wasn't going to make it. He had overshot the boat, and now it was behind him, further upstream. He forgot the tide with the last shred of his energy. His face went under again, and he gargled water, head weighing heavy like an anchor. He heard the woman scream, followed by a muted splash as she jumped in after him. Minutes later, hands pushed against his chest and back, and he scrambled to breathe again, regaining sensation in his arms and legs. "I've got you. Just breathe," the woman said in his ear. He did, and although he kicked his legs instinctively, he relaxed the rest of his muscles and allowed himself to float against her guiding hands. Somehow, with a lot of energy exerted on her part, she paddled back to the boat and helped Dylan climb inside. He rested in the standing water inside the boat, panting hard, but not as hard as her. "I'm Tess," she said, holding her knees. "It's short for Teshvar." "Dylan," he responded. "Thank you for that." "It's nothing," she said. "I actually need someone to help me get this boat free." Tess was brown-skinned and thin. Her capri pants and tank top were plastered to her skin from the water and brown with mud. Her hair was caked with a matted mess of sludge. He realized how lucky they were at that moment to be free from lacerations or broken bones. "I just came across this thing, but I can't get it out," she heaved. "This is our safe way out of here." Dylan peered downstream, reaching all the way to the horizon and beyond. "How far inland have the waters gone?" She shook her head. "I'd like to know how deep the water is. There could be buildings right below us for all I know." "Were you alone?" Dylan asked. She nodded. "I was on the beach, just taking a jog. Jesus, the wave took my fucking shoes." She wiggled her toes in the water to prove her point. "Were you alone?" "No. I need to find my family," he said. "My wife was with my 8-year-old daughter at the beach. Did you see them? A tall woman with copper hair? My daughter would have been wearing a yellow sundress." Tess watched Dylan sadly before shaking her head. "I'm sorry. There were so many people running up the beach." He scrambled into the wet pocket of his jeans, but found his cell phone was damaged in the water. Tess said the same thing about hers. Dylan hung his head. "I was with my son, Stuart. He's 19. I think he can take care of himself, if I could only find him." "Then let's get this skiff free and search for him," she said. She looked doubtfully at the diesel motor at the back of the boat. "I'll also need some help starting this thing up." Dylan stood up and inspected the nest of branches they were entangled in. He jostled his weight from side to side, and the boat rocked freely, disengaging itself from some of the refuse. Tess watched him as he inspected the motor, yanking on the pull cord and grunting for added effect. It growled hatefully in response. "You think we can cruise straight through this?" she asked. "I think it's all floating on the surface," Dylan said between full-body yanks of the cord. "If we could—" The motor sputtered into life, and Dylan and Tess smiled at each other, throwing their arms in the air. He sat down next to the motor and fiddled with the tiller, swaying the boat back and forth. With the forward momentum of the boat, they were able to split through the blockage like a knife, while wiggling side to side. As soon as their boat was free, Tess whooped happily, high-fiving Dylan and sitting down to join him. They caught the middle stream of muddy water and directed the dinghy inland, toward what Dylan hoped was civilization. Still, they hadn't spotted any people, and all the buildings in the area appeared to be leveled. Suddenly they came across a large fishing boat, which had taken on water, sitting lopsided on the surface. It was beached against something solid, and Dylan realized it was the roof of a large building, all the windows shattered. There were people on the roof, and Dylan's first instinct told him they were hurt. The sound of their engine had caught the people's attention, and they stood up on the roof, yelling and waving their arms like Tess. Dylan waved back, but noted the grave looks on their faces, their frightened eyes. Why did they look so scared? Then a gunshot went off, and Dylan fell flat on his stomach, Tess screaming from somewhere next to him. Everything happened at once. Dylan hit the deck, and the dinghy veered crazily, pulling right. Tess fell backward, and with much difficulty managed to grab onto Dylan's pant leg, hanging on for dear life. They felt the dinghy crash into something hard, and they were thrown forward into each other. Instantly, Tess was knocked unconscious. The gunfire suddenly stopped, and so did the sound of the motor. In fact, it was dead silent, except for the sound of lapping water against the side of the boat. The last thing Dylan felt were hands as they pulled him onto dry concrete. 2. Stuart sat on the roof of a building across the street, listening to the close snaps of gunshots. He was glad that he was safe and alone on his section of the street, though he did feel bad for the people in the fishing boat. He had watched it smash into the building, and all the people spilled out onto the roof, some injured and screaming. There were 5 of them in all. He could do nothing for them. He wasn't even sure how he was going to get off the roof safely. Maybe he would have to wait for help to come, a helicopter to whisk him away, but how long would that take? Would he have to spend all day on the roof in the harsh sunlight, and only a t-shirt and swim trunks? Would he have to sleep out there in the cold? Hell, he didn't even have shoes. His flip-flops were long gone, along with everything else he knew. Where was his dad, his mom and sister? He cried into his hands and winced. He had an open gash on his right side above the hip, staining his shirt a bright red, phosphorescent in the sunlight. Sadly, for the men and women on the roof across the way, they weren't alone. 3 men with guns were stranded on the roof long before them, and had begun firing into the air for intimidation. Stuart watched with horror from his perch, unable to do a thing. All that he had was the element of surprise, because no one had noticed him yet. But what could he do without getting himself killed in the process? Maybe he didn't need to help them at all. It seemed the men only wanted the boat, and while one man kept watch over the survivors with his hunting rifle, the other 2 stepped aboard the beach ship to see if they could salvage it. Yet Stuart knew it was finished. It had already started to sink, bobbing helplessly in the waves. He heard a loud crack from inside the ship, and he ducked low to the roof. He heard another crack, and then another. Someone screamed, and a strange cloud of smoke hung over the ship's deck like a cloud. It was black smoke, much darker than that of cigarette or fire. Stuart watched the men navigate the deck. One of them had set aside his gun to drag a body by the armpits. There were more gunshots, and men and women screamed. There were more survivors on the boat, either injured or combative. Either way, they were shot and killed. Stuart sensed the frustration around these men, at the realization that the boat could not carry them. All they could think to do was take it out on the innocent people aboard. Stuart screamed angrily into his hands. The men pointed handguns at the 2 bodies on the deck, which Stuart could see were still stirring in all the commotion. They fired, and the 2 men stopped stirring, just like that. Then they started digging through the pockets of the dead men, tearing open shirts and ripping off boots. They disappeared below deck and came back with another body, one of the man's brown coveralls stained red. They began the same process of rifling through his clothes, coming back with nothing in particular. Then everyone heard the sound of an engine racing closer. Stuart watched a small motorboat blink into view, with 2 people inside. They were headed straight for the fishing boat. Stuart wanted to scream, to yell at them to turn back, but it was already too late, and the gunmen had trained their weapons on the fast-approaching boat. Someone fired a shot, and the boat crashed into the building, its nose wrenching over the lip and onto the roof. The men struggled to pull the man and woman out of the boat, and Stuart recognized the man as his dad. Without a moment's hesitation, Stuart dove into the water head first. He swam furiously toward the other side of the roof, where he could sneak up on everyone. He made sure to keep his head underwater to conceal himself from the gunmen. Once he thought he was safe, he heaved himself onto the roof, hiding behind an electrical box. From his spot he could see the survivors huddled in a frightened circle, under the watchful eye of their guard. He had his back turned to Stuart. Stuart crept closer, lower to the ground. He watched the gunmen yank the rest of the boat onto dry land and inspect it. They were overjoyed, laughing and patting each other on the back. Dylan and the woman lay on the roof in a pool of water, and they looked to be unconscious. The 3rd gunman, standing guard over the 5 survivors, yelled across to his friends, asking them for an update, but his friends were too preoccupied with their inspection. Stuart crept close behind them, and some of the other survivors spotted him with wide eyes, but they were smart enough to stay quiet. With a pounding chest, Stuart sprang to his feet and knocked the gunman to the ground, his hands grappling to tear the rifle away. He struggled, but the other survivors jumped in to pull the gunman to the ground, punching and kicking him. He screamed loud enough for his friends to hear before Stuart grabbed the gun and smashed him across the forehead with the butt. He was instantly silenced. Stuart hurried to stand with the rifle set against his shoulder, noticeably shaken, but he was able to point the business end toward the men, who were now approaching him with their handguns poised. They screamed curses in his direction. Stuart was glad he had the gun with the most kick. He could blow a hole in either one of these men's chest before they could even squeeze off a few shots. "You fucking punk," the man with the gray beard growled. The other man spit on the ground, revealing a mouth full of yellow, broken teeth. Both of them wore brown coveralls, most likely a work uniform from a business in the area. Where they got the guns, Stuart didn't know. He could imagine that a lot of swamp people like them liked to conceal or carry a pistol or 2, even at work. The 5 survivors had smartly slinked away from the standoff, and Stuart made sure to walk away from them, to set them in the background. Stuart managed to breathe. steadying his weapon with an eye centered in his scope. His gun was trained on Yellow Teeth, ready to blow a hole in the back of his throat. "We can kill this fool, Tambor," the man with yellow teeth told his friend. "Shut the fuck up, Elliot." Tambor shook his head and signaled for him to follow his lead. His friend grudgingly returned to cocking his weapon. "I'm just trying to survive out here," Stewart said. "You and me both. We can all get out of this without any bloodshed," Tambor said. "Yeah, and how do we do that?" "We all drop our weapons at the same time." "Or," Stewart began, "I can shoot your friend Elliot in the head and let you two fill me full of holes. Then you'll have to go live with that." "Be fair. You don't want that, neither do we." "Enough talk," Elliot cried. "Fucking shoot him." "Shut the hell up," Tambor spat. "Don't. Both of you shut up." Stewart twisted his neck and shook the sweaty bangs from his eyes. "I'm the one talking here. Drop the guns. Now." Tambor dropped his pistol to the ground and nodded for Elliot to do the same. With much hesitation and conviction on Tambor's part, Elliot dropped his weapon and held out his hands. "Good. Now your other pistols," Stewart called. "I see one on your hip there." Tambor and Elliot exchanged a hateful look and unholstered the last of their sidearms, tossing them into the pile. Stewart instructed one of the men from the survivor group to collect the guns. He sprang into action as Stewart kept his rifle level. The man made quick work of the pistols and returned to his group with full hands. And just like that, 4 of the survivors were armed, leaving a 6-year-old boy to clutch at his mother's tattered dress. They all pointed their guns at Tambor and Elliot. "We're gonna kill you," Tambor said. Stewart liked the way he stood helpless, with his hands at his sides. "I have every intention of getting off this fucking roof before you do," Stewart motioned with the nose of his rifle. "Now you're gonna load that boat for me. And don't try anything, or I'll leave you two floating on your backs. I'm an excellent shot." "What?" Elliot protested. "Shut the fuck up," Stewart screamed, causing the survivors behind him to jump. "You're going to carry that guy and girl and put them back in the boat. It's already their property. You can't have it." They didn't move. Elliot looked at Tambor questionably, and then at the unconscious man at Stewart's feet, bleeding from his face. "You think you have more of a right to that boat than us?" Tambor asked. "Does it fucking matter? I'm trying to help the situation here, while you two are turning a disaster into a war zone. Fuck you guys. Seriously," Stewart replied. "I have more self-respect than you two, that's for sure." The two of them got moving with Tambor in the lead. They found the woman and man exactly where they'd left him, and Stewart ordered for Elliot to take the girl, and Tambor to take Dylan. Stewart stood watch as the men stooped down and loaded the unconscious bodies into the boat. Stewart stayed a good 10 feet behind them, the rifle trained on their backs. They set the woman down in the back of the boat with Dylan beside her. Stewart ordered for them to drag the boat back into water. Stewart ordered the 3 urban soldiers to sit on the other side of the roof, some 20 yards away as he got into the boat, motioning for the 5 survivors to follow. They gratefully packed inside the dinghy, elbow to gut, but they all managed to fit. Stewart set the rifle down and pushed off from the shore with the help of the other men. He felt the ground drop out underneath him and the water take control, pushing him and then reeling him back, pulling harder for every instant it pushed him. He yanked on the pull cord, which was a lot harder than it looked, and by his 15th try he had the motor purring. Looking up through the black smoke from the motor, he saw Tambor and Elliot standing on the roof, the water lapping over their boots without care. Even from his distance he could see their eyes, but they weren't full of malice, or hate, or defeat. They were empty, almost pained. Judging by their blank expressions as he pushed off from the boat, he could tell they didn't want to stop him. No, they wanted to go with him. He left them behind in a final spray of water and smoke. 3. Dylan snapped out of his dream, springing into a sitting position like a triggered mousetrap. He started to cough, hands touching his own mouth and eyes, tears coursing and his legs convulsing. One of his feet kicked something soft, and he saw a leg pull away from him out of sight. He looked up at a man sitting across from him, cradling a rifle in his arms. The gun shook in his hands. He pulled away from them, but bumped into more people, hands materializing out of the blur to catch him. The ground dipped as though he was still in his dream, experiencing that restless torrent of water as it washed him out to sea. A spray of water speckled his arms. He sat in a small boat, the same dinghy he had crashed into the building. Glancing up into the face of the man, Dylan felt another faint coming on, but he tensed the muscles in his neck, resisting the urge to drop his head. Was that... "Hey, Dad," Stewart said, and everyone in the boat burst out laughing. Thankfully, the water level began to recede and the signs of civilization were plentiful. There were several other boats in the water, operated by disaster relief officials in brightly colored clothing. There were people all around, wading in the water up to their knees and panting like dogs. People screamed and cried, lay down on floating boards when they couldn't walk, and allowed others to guide them downstream. There were a great many bodies in the water as well, collecting in pockets of trash and rubble. Stewart managed to dock their dinghy against a wall of overturned cars and helped the men and women to step off one by one. He received his fair share of hugs and God's blessings before they hobbled away toward the camp. FEMA had set up a large relief camp in a gutted building on their right-hand side, where tents and tarps flapped in the breeze. An overwhelming amount of people had flocked there, and medicine personnel were providing assistance to injured people in the mud with very little else. Tess stood nearby, glancing doubtfully at the firearms in the boat. Dylan thought twice, but grabbed one of the pistols for himself, tucking it into the band of his pants. He threw his son a hard look when he tried to take his own gun. "I saved your ass back there," Stewart said with a grin. "And I think that's enough for one day," Dylan replied dryly. They hurried to the closest personnel they could find, a fretting nurse with her arms full of clipboards and papers. It looked like people were pulling her in 1,000 directions at once, but she was willing to stop for a minute with her feet sinking in the mud. Dylan gave her the description of his wife and daughter, but she could only suggest he look around. Again, he described his daughter to her, asking her to listen carefully. The nurse looked over his shoulder at something. "There's a camp not far away. They've sent a lot of injured people our way," the nurse continued. "It's in the swampland a mile down the road, and they've set up a place to keep people. They have a lot of children down there, separated from their parents. You might want to try there." "Thank you," Dylan said, and the crowd carried her away. "Dad, I'm going to look for Mom," Stewart said, and before Dylan could protest, he was already gone. "He'll be right back," Tess said, stepping back a few paces. Dylan followed her, holding his head. "We have to find a car or something." "We will," she assured him. He looked up at her, actually smiling. "Did I say thank you yet?" he asked. She laughed. "I should really be thanking your son. Listen, if there's anything I can help you with, I appreciate it, but I think my parents are safe at home," she said, turning her head to peer into the sky. "I still think I should go. I need to make sure they're okay." For the first time, Dylan realized how young she was, maybe his son's age or younger. How the hell had she carried him through the water and into the boat so easily? It was nothing short of a miracle in Dylan's mind. "You should go," Dylan told her, squeezing her arm. She smiled and hugged him for a long moment, and then she broke away. "Just a mile up the road," Tess reminded him as she jogged up the hill. "Good luck!" And then Teshwar passed out of his life for good. An hour later, Stewart ducked out of the camp and found his dad, but with little good news. He had checked the countless rows of bunks himself and read the updated register of people who could be identified, or had at least washed ashore with a driver's license. While he was there, he snagged a bandage for his injured side, which he patched up with his father looking on. They decided to jog down the road toward the next camp, and hoped there were some signs to point them in the right direction. Once they were free of the congestion, the people in the wreckage, they couldn't tell if there had been a flood at all. The road was clean and dry, and also clear of traffic. Minutes later, Dylan had to slow to a brisk walk. Stewart was the one with the gash in his side, and could jog for the rest of the mile, though he was willing to walk with his father. Up ahead they found a pickup with its rear wheels hanging off over the shoulder, and the keys dangling in the ignition. Stewart tried to take the driver's seat, but his father pulled him back and took the wheel. He sped west, slowing frequently to weave past more abandoned cars or through blinking red lights. Only a few minutes into the drive, he felt something warm drip on his arm. He looked down to find a drop of blood, and when he looked in the rear-view mirror, his upper lip and chin were pouring. He could already feel his vision blurring, and his reflection inside the mirror was spinning, and then ducking out of view. His forehead bounced off the steering wheel, his head proceeding to roll into the window. He felt that briefly before his lights went out. 4. When Dylan came to, he was lying in the grass, the car parked on the side of the road next to him. A man rooted around inside the back. Dylan lifted himself up on his elbows, his head still heavy but clearer. He could see the man clear enough, even as the blurred edges of his eyes still threatened to steal his consciousness. "Hey," he called. The man pulled his head out of the car and looked at Dylan. He smiled and hurried to his side. He was tall and thin. There was a pair of snakeskin cowboy boots on his feet and a cowboy hat on his head. He wore a loose-fitting tank top and jean shorts, which Dylan was quite sure were cut-offs. What struck Dylan at the last second was how unbelievably pale this man was. The black hairs on his legs and arms stood out much darker on his milky skin. There was something off about him, and Dylan was willing to excuse the cowboy hat and boots. Past that was an alien quality, like watching a tropical animal suddenly thrown into the middle of the desert, expected to survive. "Good Lord, mister, are you all right?" the man asked him. "Fuck," was all Dylan managed. "You were out cold," the man said. His teeth were crooked, but clean. His face was speckled with careless stubble and his cheekbones were raised, single-handedly pulling the skin tight over his face like the hide over a drum. There was a lot of character in his features, that was for sure, but it was his eyes that were truly magnificent. They were green and intricate, like the innards of a geode. "You pulled me out?" Dylan asked. "Yeah, I was just walking by when I saw your car," the man said. "I don't know if you crashed or not. Your nose was all bloody. I mean, there was blood everywhere. Your kid ran up the road to get help. I was just coming down from the camp up there." "The camp? It's close?" "Yeah, just around the bend," he said. "I can take you there in no time." Dylan ran the back of his hand under his nose. To his relief, the blood was dry, and it was still drying on his collar and arms. He closed his eyes and shook his head. "I think I'm okay." "Thank God for that." His eyes sparked and refocused. "That could have ended badly for you." "Thanks for your help," Dylan said, and when he tried to stand up, the man eased him back down with his hands. "Just the rest there for a second, okay?" Dylan loosened underneath his stare. "Okay." The man sat down next to him, lifting the hat off his head to dry his brow. The hair underneath was greasy and matted down. His bangs stood out as knotty tendrils across his forehead. He set the hat down between them, and Dylan noticed the green feather for the first time, stuck into the hat's band. The man named Warren directed him down a few back roads and into a swampy area, where a gate barricaded a country road with padlocks and chains. From there they jumped a wire fence and hiked into the boonies. There was an unmistakable musty smell of marshland, and the air sat sticky and wet over their heads. Even before they reached the campground, Dylan could hear the voices of people and even children, which set Dylan's heart back in its place. They tore out of the brush and found a circular crop of land, stamped flat by human feet and cleared out by human hands. There were a dozen good-sized tents set up in a triangle inside the campground, a cooling fire pit in the center of it all, and Dylan could find no shortage of people, women and men, gaggles of children grouped together around the fire, some crying and others keeping to themselves. They approached the tents, and before they could even get close, one of them unzipped and a man stepped out. He looked awful. His clothes were wrinkled and sweat-stained, and his eyes were dark with no sleep. He smiled at Dylan, but could not keep it alive for very long. "Did you hear us coming?" Warren asked. "I heard something." He shook Dylan's hand and introduced himself as Keller. He was very glad to meet him. "Nice to meet you." Keller withdrew to sit on a makeshift bench of logs. Running his fingers through his tangled nest of hair, he motioned for the two of them to join him. Before Dylan could sit, he looked around the faces in the crowd, searching for his son. He called his name, and a voice soon answered. "Dad?" Stuart appeared and ran into his father's arms. "We were just about to head out. We found another car." He looked sadly into his dad's face. "You look awful," Stuart said. "Is Emma here?" Dylan asked. Stuart frowned and looked at his feet. "I couldn't find her, Dad, but there are so many kids here. I couldn't see every kid's face, but I called her name and everything, and asked some of the women." He shook his head, and Dylan placed a hand on his shoulder. He swooned into his son, who caught him and eased him on the bench next to Warren. Someone hurried to his side with a bottle of water, and he drank deeply. "So this is your dad?" Keller asked, and Stuart nodded. He gave Dylan a reproachful look, before yawning loudly. He pulled a tobacco pipe out of his pocket and lit up in front of them, offering it to them, but they passed. "We were about to get a car and check one of the other camps up the road," Stuart said to his father. "Then I'm coming with you," Dylan said. He attempted to stand, but his son held him back. "Nonsense," Keller said. "You will rest here. That's why we're here, to accommodate people like you." He blew smoke rings into the air. "I'll come right back if I find Emma or Mom," Stuart assured him. "I know how to get back here before morning, okay? Just get some rest." Then Stuart stepped away and left his father's side. "What is your child's name?" Keller asked. "Emma," Dylan said. A tent shook off to their right, and a woman emerged from the folds, as tousled and dirty as Keller, but better rested. She had a robust pair of lips and slanted brown eyes, her hair pulled back into a long braid. She stood tall in front of Dylan, her shoulders square and her red lips pursed. She wore a kind of satin shawl around her neck, a black long-sleeve shirt, and a pair of faded blue jeans. She greeted them and sat down next to Warren. Her legs immediately crossed, one bare foot positioned in the nook of her knee, while the other was tucked under her leg. "Your daughter's name is Emma?" she asked, breathing deeply. "I know the name of every child in this camp, and there is no one named Emma." Dylan looked up at her pleadingly. He could still hear the children behind him, and he searched their faces for his daughter. "Can you describe her to me?" the woman asked curtly. "Yes. She has blonde hair, a yellow dress," Dylan said, closing his eyes. "She had pink sandals. She's 8 years old, but my son didn't see her here." "Some children are resting in the tents," the woman replied. "As you can see, we have many children to look after, though there are many more you don't see." "Is she okay?" Dylan asked with tears in his eyes. The woman stood up without emotion, looking down at Dylan like a guard in front of a tower. Then she strode past the group of children and ducked into one of the tents. Dylan moved to follow, but Warren touched his shoulder, anchoring him to the bench. She came back with a small girl in her arms, but it didn't look like she had yellow hair or a yellow dress. The girl was covered in mud, sucking her thumb and staring into space. Dylan knew it was her, and Keller allowed him to stand up. "Emma!" Dylan called. Immediately, the girl turned her head and looked into Dylan's face. Then she withdrew her frightened eyes. She started to scream and cry, and the woman held Emma closer to her breast, stepping away defensively. "Emma," Dylan said, but he had lost his smile. He dropped his arms and tried to calm his voice. "It's me, Dad. Come on, sweetie. It's me." This only made her cry harder, hiding her face in the woman's hands. The woman gave Dylan a suspicious look. "It's the blood," Dylan told her. He tried vainly to wipe it clean from his face, licking his palms and rubbing his cheeks. "See? It's okay, honey. I'm okay. It was a bloody nose, that's all." Emma continued to cry, and the woman turned to walk away. "No, stop!" Dylan reached out to grab her arm, but Keller had already grabbed him. "Let's take it easy," Keller breathed behind him. Dylan watched Warren rush to his side, patting the cowboy hat on his head, feather dancing. "I'm calm," Dylan said. He pulled back, but got the same amount of resistance on the other end. "Just let go of—" The woman had already carried Emma back to the tent, and Dylan seized against his restraints. Now Warren had grabbed him by his wrist, with his fingernails biting into his skin. Keller ripped the pistol from the band of Dylan's pants. "Sit back down," Warren demanded. "Get the fuck up!" Warren punched Dylan in the gut, doubling him over on his knees. Keller shoved Warren backward, but did not offer a helping hand to the man on the ground, gasping in the dirt. "Listen, this is my fucking camp." Keller bent over Dylan to peer into his bloody face. "I know you've been through a shitstorm, as have we, but we're doing our best out here. We have to be careful, especially when your own daughter doesn't recognize you. I understand, I do, but let's wait this out. Sleep here tonight and we'll see what your daughter says in the morning." "Just let me see her," Dylan spat. "She's in shock, damn it, and so are you." Keller stood up to tower over him. "Just let her rest. I swear to you she's well taken care of. Will you trust me there?" Dylan waited a long second, spitting in the dirt and allowing his hair to hang free. Finally, he nodded. The men helped him to his feet and led him into one of the tents. It wasn't empty. There were people fast asleep, curled up in the back. They left Dylan to sleep on a tarp. He thought he would rest his head for a minute and call for them back again, but the second he closed his eyes, sleep took him by surprise. The next morning, Dylan came out of his tent at 6 a.m. to find everyone already awake, congregating in front of the fire pit, which had smoldered all night. Stuart sat outside with Emma on his knee, bobbing her up and down happily. She was bright and smiling, giggling and holding tight to Stuart's chest. "Daddy!" she cried and ran into his arms. He lifted her in the air, crying and kissing her face. "You were asleep for so long. They told me not to wake you." "I'm so glad I'm awake," he sobbed, hugging both Emma and Stuart to her chest. He ruffled his son's hair. "Sorry, Dad," Stuart said. "It was stupid. I should have checked all the tents. She was here all the time." The woman from the night before invited Dylan to sit by the fire with the rest of the group. Keller and Warren sat across the way, watching him silently. They offered him a smile when he looked their way. "Does anyone here have a cell phone?" Dylan asked. Keller didn't even look at him. "They're all dead. I had a working one last night, but there's no reception anyway." "I wanted to call my wife," Dylan said. "Maybe she has her phone working." "Stu says Mommy's okay out there," Emma said on Dylan's lap. "She'll come find us, won't she, Daddy?" "Sure she will, sweetheart. But if I could find her first." Tell me the word and I'll drive you out there, Stewart said. I'll go alone. He waved his son away when he started to argue. No, stay here with Emma. Please, Stu. Someone has to. At least I know you two are safe here. His son nodded solemnly, and Dylan patted him on the back. I'm going to find her. Stewart offered a thin smile, but quickly lost it. Why hasn't anyone come for us? Dylan asked the group. They will, Killer said. In the meantime, we're the help. Right now, most efforts are aimed at search and rescue, picking through the trash on flooded land for stranded people. That may go on for the next couple days. At least you have your children, the woman said, smiling at Emma. Once I reconnect all these kids with their parents, then my work is done. But I fear it'll never be done. I don't think I'll be leaving here anytime soon. A box of food made its way to Dylan, and he scrounged inside, finding bottles of water, granola bars, and even bread. He helped himself to an energy bar and made it disappear. They had enough food to last them for the rest of the day, though they depended on a new shipment before nightfall. Keller did not look overly concerned, yet he didn't seem overly confident either. Dylan drank sparingly from his water bottle before setting it aside. What organization are you from? Dylan asked them finally. FEMA? Red Cross? The woman smiled. We're not from any organization. We came together at the last minute, and amazingly so. She exchanged glances with Keller, who smiled back. You're kidding, Stewart said. You're just a bunch of normal guys? In these normal times? The woman asked with a chuckle. No, we're quite abnormal. She leaned across the fire to shake Dylan's hand. I'm Hope, by the way. Your name's Hope? Emma asked with her legs dangling. That's a pretty name. 5. The next morning, Dylan woke up bruised and sore. He could have slept another 6 hours, but he surrendered to the alarm clock and got up, after throwing it as hard as he could against the wall. He attempted to stretch his back, but abandoned that after it locked and dragged him back into the bed. Once his feet were firmly set on the carpet, a series of images flashed behind his eyes. Dylan shook off the dreams and turned on the TV as he brewed some coffee. Of course, the tsunami was international news. Rescue crews were just making their way into Ground Zero, where the death toll was steadily rising with the slow ebb of the water line. A lot of the flooding had pulled away, but it was still 20 feet high in some places. Dylan knew this all too well. As he drank his coffee, he watched incomplete images of people screaming and flooded buildings, capsized cars, and countless numbers of stranded people huddled on rooftops or tall trees. These were the people Dylan wished he could have helped. His own independent rescue mission had been successful enough, but that had been 2 days ago, just after the tsunami's relentless first act. He searched all day yesterday, at every camp he could find, yet he couldn't find his wife, Deborah. He had promised to come back for Stewart and Emma, but settled for a motel room instead, not far down the road. The owner was willing to let him stay there for free. Dylan wasn't the only guest sleeping off the horrors of the tsunami. He must have called Deborah's cell phone 100 times from the phone in the motel lobby, but it went straight to voicemail every time. It was the 3rd day of the catastrophe. The tsunami had closed to complete its final act, leaving only aftermath. The wind and rain had relented for the day, and Dylan had a calm sky to ironically contrast the pulpy soup on the ground. Now that the waters had receded enough, rescue efforts were at their peak. If Dylan was going to search one more time for Deborah, this was his opportunity. He finished his coffee and walked outside into the parking lot. His eyes were immediately drawn to the vacancy sign, burning red, and a strange creep of goose flesh came over him. He stopped and turned his head in a slow pan. There was the ice machine in the street, currently empty. Dylan felt a sudden itch of unease crawl up his back. It was something like déjà vu, as if everything was set up beforehand, ready to pull out from under him like a carpet. He closed his eyes and exhaled slowly, and when he opened them again, the birds were still in the trees. He looked around with bated breath. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. As it should be. He was just about to set things right and push on, when something moved beside him. The door to one of the parked cars opened, and a woman stepped out. Dylan whipped his head back and almost lost his balance. The woman smiled at him, her eyes kind. She wore a pair of short shorts and a tank top, surprisingly clean, something you would expect someone to wear in Florida. Her copper hair was short and her frame was thin, save for wide hips. She was older than him, maybe by a few years, yet he was willing to admit she was attractive, especially with her nose piercing. He knew this woman. Dylan didn't waste a moment before he ran into her arms and kissed her on the lips. "Deborah," he cried. "Thank God, how did you find me?" "I didn't know which room you were in, but I saw your car," Deborah laughed. "I just pulled up, but waited a minute. I hope you'd come out." "How'd you know what car I was driving?" Dylan asked. "If you would have just stayed at the camp, you moron," she teased him. "I got there a few hours after you left. Stu told me what you were driving, and I've been looking for you this whole time." Dylan responded by kissing her again on the lips. "How'd you get off the beach?" Dylan asked her. He held her at arm's length and looked her over. "Forget it," he said, when she opened her mouth to speak. "I've thought too much about it anyway. I don't even know how I got out." He walked around the front of the car and opened the passenger door. Deborah watched him silently and understood. "Can you drive?" Dylan asked. "Great.